All right, we're going to start off with actually chapter 20. This is 20.1. I've tried a bunch to do chapter 19, but had some glitches there and need to look at it a bit deeper to make sure that you guys have the background information for it. So for now, we'll do this is your corresponding with your book. This is not the textbook pages because this is using a different textbook. But it is the chapter 20 and 20.1 that goes along with your booklet. So in this chapter, we're going to go through, it's going to look at some populations. So we're looking at species, how they're distributed, some population sizes, how they grow, what a carrying capacity is, and types of growth again. And then some sort of growth strategies. So strategies on how a species grows. So it says analyzing populations. It says recall that a population is a group of organisms belonging to the same species that interact within a defined area. What, then, is a species and a community? So if we're looking at a species, it says a population is a group of organisms belonging to the same species. So then what is a species? Well, if you remember back to Bio 20, right at the time we were looking at classification, it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. I think I missed one in there, but sort of that hierarchy of classification. And species is at the very bottom, so it's the most specific thing that you can find. So specifically, we are Homo sapiens, and our species is sapiens as humans. And then what is a community? Well, a community is an area that has basically a bunch of different species living in it. So that would make up a community, where a population is a bunch of the same species. Populations may be assessed according to their size, total number of organisms, or density. So it depends on what type of organism you're looking at. Like if I wanted to say how many species of grass or how many individual species of grass are on my lawn, I'm not going to go out and count every single blade of grass because that would take forever. So you might look at like, oh, there's this much grass in a centimeter, and then times it by how big your area is. So that's sort of like estimation strategy, but per an area. If you look at this picture here, we've got some bunnies, and you might, for bunnies, say that there is a certain number of organisms, just because with species that move around, it might be difficult to start counting in one space. So I guess I should get my pen here. So if I started counting, seems like this is not working. Perfect. So if I started counting at this bunny, and then I start going down the list, by that time maybe some of these bunnies have jumped back into the space I've already counted, and then I'm going to miss them. So it's a better idea if we are just looking at sort of like, oh, there's this many in this little section or this square, and then timesing it by the total area. That's sort of just a way of calculating. So when you hear about them saying like there's only this many species or only this many individuals of this type of species left, likely they don't have an exact number, but they're figuring that out from different sampling strategies. So what are some benefits and drawbacks of each method? Well, I just sort of went over that. If we're going to count each individual, it's going to take a really long time. Density is probably a better thing, especially if they are in a dense area, but it might also be bad if we were doing density and we decided to only count this, only count that square. So we're going to count how many bunnies are in that square, and then we're going to times it by how many squares are here to figure out the density. Well, there's no bunnies in that square, so that's a really bad way of doing it. So you need to make sure that you're weighing out the pros and cons of what you're doing, basically. All right, so how do we calculate population density? So density is sort of how many species are in one area. If we're looking at countries of humans, Canada doesn't have a very high population density. Basically, every person has, for every, I don't know, I don't actually know the measurement, so I'm not going to make it up. But basically, there's more people in Canada have more space per person compared to China, for instance. So China would have a bigger population density. And if we're thinking about times like now when we're in a pandemic, this is definitely a time where we would want to have a lower population density, because if there's less people in an area, less chance of spreading a disease. More people, greater chance of it sort of going crazy. So population density is defined as the number of individual organisms in a given area. So it gives you some examples here. It says a field with an area of 100 meters squared is populated by an average of 155 gophers. What is the population density of gophers in the field? So we're going to use this formula in a second, but I'm going to just read the other example as well. The other example is the density of a population of bears is 2.3 bears per kilometer squared. If the bears are distributed over an area of 50 kilometers squared, what is the total population size? So if we're looking at this formula here, and I'm just going to double check that I'm getting this right, because I didn't know it didn't tell us. But this formula that's on here is in your Bio30 formula booklet that you would get if you were doing the diploma exam, but you guys won't be doing that, luckily for you, in some ways, maybe not in others. But in the formula booklet, this formula is there, and it tells us what each of these things are. So DP is, probably you can guess it, is the population density. So the population density, and I'm going to write DP there. Okay, the N is going to be the number of individuals. So I'm going to put a number sign of individuals. And then the A stands for the area. So the area that the species are occupying, or the area of the population, okay? So now that we know those two, we can actually calculate the answers to both of these examples. And I'm going to, I don't know, I need to write over top of these mountains. Does this show up? Not so great. Maybe black would be the best. Okay, let's just write it beside. I'll try and write really small. So a field with an average area of, as we're going through these questions, we're going to write down the piece of information that they're giving us. So they're giving us an area of 100 meters squared. So if we look at our formula, we've got 3 letters. Which one is involved with area? Area. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight that as well. So our area, if we look at this, A is equal to area. So I'm going to write A is equal to 100 meters squared. And it's populated by an average of 155 gophers. So is that our population density, or is that the number of individuals? Well, it's saying an average of 150 gophers. The gophers would be individuals. So for my individuals, which is N, I'm going to write 155. Okay. Now, if the question's asking, what is the population density of gophers in the field? Well, it's a pretty simple calculation we've got to do here. We just got to plug these numbers into this formula. So we are looking for dP. That's what we don't know. It's equal to N. And N is, in our calculation, is 155 divided by our A, which is, in our question, 100. So if we go 155 divided by 100, then we will get the population density. And this is an easy one to do, but you can use a calculator if you'd like. The answer is 1.55, and that's our population density. So that would be our answer. We would just, I don't know, put a circle around it. Okay, so let's try the next question. This one, as we're reading through, how I always do all my math problems, is we will highlight the pieces of information that go into our formula. So it says the density of a population of bears is 2.3 bears per kilometer squared. So I'm going to highlight that. I don't know why my highlighting was so terrible here. Anyway. Okay, so 2.3 bears per kilometer squared. If the bears are distributed over an area of 50 kilometers, so that's another piece of information we need, then what is the total population size? So the question's asking, what is the total population size? If we look at over here, which one is talking about population size? That would be our number of individuals, because that is our size of our population. Not our density, but our size. So this question is looking for N. So, oops. So our N is the thing that we don't know. Our A and our dP is given to us in the question. Our area, if we look through, is 50 kilometers squared. So I'm going to write that there. And our dP, or our population density, they said is 2.3 bears. So that's 2.3 in every kilometer squared. Okay. So this one's a little bit more complicated because we've got to rearrange the equation. And I'm not doing this really in the best spot to write this. I'm going to, unfortunately, write it up here. So we need to find N. So if I write out the formula, dP is equal to N divided by A. That's our formula. What I like to do is rearrange it before I plug the numbers in. So I want N to be by itself, which means I'm going to have to move this A over here. And to move it over there, I can't just move it over. I've got to do basically the opposite the opposite of what it is on this side. And on this side is n divided by a, right? Because that's a division. So to get it to the other side, what we need to do to both sides is do the opposite. And the opposite of division is always multiplication. So we're going to multiply both sides by a. So when I multiply both sides by a divided by a, that gets rid of it. So I'm going to rewrite this over here. This becomes dp times a is equal to n. So now that I've got that formula rearranged, I can plug in my pieces of information I have. So I've got a dp. Remember back over here, it's 2.3. So I'm going to put that right underneath the dp. Multiplied by the a, which we found out to be 50. So if I do that in my calculator, 2.3 times 50 will give us 115. And remember, n stands for the number of individuals, and we're looking at bears. So that's 115 bears. So the whole question, it's saying if there's 2.3 bears in every kilometer squared, and there's 50 kilometers squared, how many bears do you got? Well, if you've got an area of 50 kilometer squares, you should have about 115 bears. So this is a formula that lots of like wildlife people would use because they're using it to figure out some things about the population and keep populations going. Okay. I wanted to go back to the first example here because we were looking at population density and I didn't write any units for my answer. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But my units for this answer are gophers per meter squared. Because we've got meter squared as our units of area. Okay, so 1.55 gophers per meter squared. You can't actually have 1.55 gophers. Well, you could, but they wouldn't necessarily be alive. So it would probably round that up if we were doing this realistically to 2. So 2 gophers in every meter squared, which is actually quite a few gophers. And we know for gophers that they are pretty, there's a lot of them. Let's just say that. Okay, so that is some examples, and you'll probably have to do a couple of these in your assignment. And if you have any questions about that, just let me know. I will put up the formula booklet with these notes. All right, so as far as population distribution, so how populations are sort of spread out, we've got clumped, uniform, and random. So clumped, you can see in this picture here that it tends to be sort of like in little sections. They're sort of clumped together, and this is pretty realistic for life. It says here that this may reflect the distribution of resources. So there's water and all the species live around the water. There's a big field, and none of them want to live out in the field to get eaten by predators. So they tend to not necessarily be uniform like this. This is not really like real life. They tend to be more clumped because they need to be clumped around where they can get food and where they can get water and where they can get shelter. And then random is sort of like clumped, but it's unpredictable. And these are normally for species which don't really have strong interaction. So they're not like pack species or species that really like to live together in big groups. They might just be a couple together. And you might see this in some birds where they will live sort of randomly. It looks random, but it's likely that they're living wherever the trees are or wherever the food is, but they tend not to be in big clumps. When you look at these species, this could be like wolves or something who live in packs. They live in groups, where random you can look outside and see like two birds fly together. So it's definitely more for species that don't really need to interact too much. It might only live in a smaller group. So population distribution refers to the patterns of distribution of a population in a given area. How might the pattern of distribution impact our estimation of population density? So if we're doing our estimations like we did back here, that's really going to be following a uniform, which really isn't likely what's going to happen in real life. We're going to just assume it's uniform, but it's not really. So this could definitely affect how we're going to estimate population density. The next one is looking at changes in population size. So there's 4 things that can change your population size. And the things that will change your population size are birth, or natality is what they call. And I like to put signs by this. This means you're adding things to the population. I feel like I should have adding as being something that's not red. Red looks like you're being lost from the population. What the freak? Learning how to use the iPad for the first time. There we go. And then immigration as well. So immigration is people coming into your population. It's going to be a positive. And then death rate, that's going to be a negative. So you're going to lose people from your population. And then emigration is people moving away. So it's sort of like the opposite of immigration, where you move away. Like I moved away from Nova Scotia. So I emigrated from Nova Scotia and I immigrated to Alberta. So if we add all these things together, then we can find out the change in the population size. So what this formula means is N refers to the number of individuals. And this is looking at those positive things. And this is taking away those negative things. So we add the births and the immigrants minus the deaths and the immigrants. And we can calculate how many people have been added or taken away from the population as a whole. Oops. So there's not an example of that, but I have full faith that you'll be able to do that. So this, I guess I should have explained this one thing, which you guys have probably seen in math before. I'm gonna hope. That triangle, which is known as delta. So delta means change. So the change in the number of individuals in a population is equal to all of the births and the immigrants minus all of the deaths and the immigrants. Okay, so I have faith that you guys will be able to if you have an example, but let me know if you need any help on that. So growth rate. This is looking at how fast things grow. And the rate at which a population can be determined by comparing the change in number of individuals over a defined period of time. This is going to give you an example. So before we read the example, I want to go over the formula here to explain what each of the pieces of this formula mean. So GR is going to be your growth rate. So that's probably pretty obvious. So how fast or slow your population is growing, and it's equal to the change in the number of individuals divided by the change in time. So growth rate could look really fast at some point and then really slow at other points. So it's depending on what little section of time we're looking at to figure out the growth rate. Excuse me. And the per capita growth rate is basically showing the change in a population side compared to its initial population. So if we look at a population that has one person living in it and we look at it the next year and there's two, well, it's actually grown 50%. But 50% wasn't really that many species if you think about it. So it sort of puts that into perspective. Where another population might have like 100,000 and they grow by like 2%, but that's actually a lot more people or species than that one that was added. So per capita sort of puts it into perspective, sort of showing how much it's grown in comparison to how many species live in the population. So let's do an example here. It says in 2012, the population of gophers in the field was 170. So reading this, I'm going to highlight the pieces that are important. So in 2012, there was 170 gophers in a field. Then by 2018, there was 245 gophers. They're showing you how to do this right there. But I'll just explain it up in the corner. So they're telling us that if we wanted to figure out the growth rate, we would write GR is equal to the change in the number of individuals. So our change in number of individuals is whatever we ended with, which in 2018 was 245, minus however many we started with, which is 170. Because if we minus those two numbers, it's going to tell us how many species that were added to the population. Okay, so that's 75. Okay, so for our delta N, or a change in our population, it grew by 75. That's a plus sign. Trying to put a plus sign. And then we need to divide it by our time, our change in time. So if we look at our years, we ended in 2018, started in 2012. If we minus those two, we can figure out how many years as well. So 2018 minus 2012, that'll tell us how many years it was. So if we do that math, the answer is 6. Okay. So in a 6-year period, the population of gophers rose by 75. So if we want to find the growth rate, we just divide those two numbers. So growth rate is equal to 75 gophers divided by the 6 years. So if I do that in my calculator, I will get 12.5, which is what they did there. I don't like that I'm all in the corner here. I need to fix this. So we have 12.5 gophers per year. So that's telling us that in order to move in 6 years, how many gophers? We averaged about 12.5 gophers extra to the population every year. So that's showing us how much it's growing per year. Okay? So that's another type of formula that you need to know how to use. So here's a practice. Guess we should do this one. So it says in 1995, the population of beavers and red deer was determined to be 205. Red deer covers an area of approximately 70 kilometers squared. By 2015, 195 of those beavers had died, and 240 beavers were born. 8 beavers left the area, and 11 joined. So that's all the information that you will need to do these 7 different questions. So the first one is determine the population density of beavers in Red Deer in 1995. So if I go back to here, they're asking us for population density, so we need this formula. dP is equal to N over A. So dP is equal to N over A. I'm just going to write that there, and then I can fill in my information. So they want us to know, the population density, which is dP. N is our number of individuals. So in 1995, let's go back to the question. It says there in the population there was 205. So we're going to write 205 and divided by the area. They say the area of Red Deer is 70 kilometers squared. So if I put that into my calculator, 205 divided by 70, I'll get 2.93. And this is beavers per kilometer squared. So if this was real data, I'm not sure if it is, but we could look, they're saying that about every kilometer squared in Red Deer, there is 3 beavers. So that is the density. So if we're looking around, likely they're not all randomly or sort of evenly distributed, but they are probably clumped, living in dams or in areas where there's water. But that sort of gives you an idea of how many beavers might live in the area. Determine the change in beaver population size from 1995 to 2015. So, if we're doing change in population size, we're going to be using this formula. So let's go back to here. So for number 2, I feel like I don't have enough room here. I'll write number 2 at the top. We're figuring out the population change. So the formula for that is delta N is equal to the natalities plus the immigrants minus the mortalities plus the immigrants. So if we look at this question, it says that we're looking at it between 1995 and 2015. So we need to figure out some of these things. How much did the population change? Well, let's plug this information in. So it says by 2015, 195 beavers had died. So that would be mortalities. So I'm going to put 195 here under M. And 240 were born. So under N, I'm going to put 240. 8 beavers left the area. So that's emigrants. So 8 beavers left and 11 joined. Okay. So if we add all that together, that'll give us the change. So 240 plus 11 gives me 251. And then I gotta do 195 plus 8 gives me 203. And then if I minus those two numbers, I get 48. So to the answer to number 2, what is the change? So from 1995 to 2015, that's 20 years, the population went up by 48. So it's good to write plus 48. Okay, so then they're asking us what is the new beaver population in 2015. So in 1995, there was 205. And then in all of those 20 years, the population went up by 48, which means that the total population is 253. So it was 205 in 1995, and in 2015, the population was 253. For number 4, it says determine the growth rate of the beaver population between 1995 and 2005. So, if you look back to here, the growth rate is using GR is equal to delta N over delta T. So, I'm going to write that. There. So our growth rate, we're trying to figure that out. We don't know what it is. And our change, or our delta N, well, we've actually figured that out in this question up here. So remember we were figuring out delta N, which is 48. So we're going to write 48 there. And then the time, how long is it between 2015 and 1995? Well, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that's 20 years. So then all we've got to do is go 48 divided by 20, and we get 2.4. So basically what this is saying is that the beaver population went up by 2.4, or almost 2.5 beavers every year. Okay, so that's that answer there. Number 5, it says determine the per capita growth rate of beavers between 1995 and 2015. So if we're looking at the per capita growth rate of beavers, it's going to look at the per capita is the growth rate, how much the beavers grew over how many we had initially in the population. So let me write down that formula. So our growth rate is equal to our delta N over our N. For our, sorry, I'm sort of making a mess here. It was actually very difficult to find a program that I could actually write on, so I'm happy that this is at least letting me do this. So for number 5, we're doing the per capita. So our per capita, we're using our delta N. For this is 48 divided by the N. So it's how many beavers were in the population when we started. Well, there was 205. So if we go 48 divided by 205, we'll get our answer. And I'm just gonna double check that I did that right. Yes. So our answer is 0.23. Okay. So basically what that's saying is that the population went up 23%. If we wanted to change it to a percent, if that makes more sense. It does to me at least. So that's what that's saying. It's went up by 23%. Now it's saying determine the new population density of beavers in 2015. So the new population density. So if we go back to population density, that's using our DP formula. So that's the formula that we used right there. I'm going to write 6 over here. DP is equal to N over A. So what's our new population? Well, our new population size is 253 in 2015, divided by our area, which is 70. So there's going to be slightly more dense. Our population density is 3.6 beavers per kilometer squared. So in 1995, we had 2.9 beavers in every kilometer squared. Now we got 3.6. So if we're looking at that, that's, as a biologist, you would say back in 1995, this is 3, because we don't cut beavers in half. And then in here, since this is 0.6, we would round this up to 4. So it's not a lot of beavers added to the population, only 48 over 20 years, but that actually changes the density by a whole beaver, which is, I guess, a lot. Sort of sounds funny. And then number 7, is the beaver population growing or shrinking, and how do you know? Well, we know it is not shrinking, it's growing. So I guess I can write growing. How do we know that? Well, the density went up, right? So this number, 3.6, is bigger than 2.93. We know that it is more species were added to the population. Just gonna see how much farther this goes. Okay. I just don't want to overwhelm you too much today. So the next part here, that's all the calculations that you'll have to do basically, except for one in chapter 19, which I will do when I can figure out how I'm going to teach that to you without confusing you too much. So anyway, carrying capacity and growth models. So if we're looking at different species, basically, they have a carrying capacity, and what that means is it's a theoretical maximum number of individuals that can be supported in a given area with a limited number of resources. So what that means in normal terms is that this is how many species can live in an area without running out of resources. So they actually have a carrying capacity that they think is in the earth. They believe that the population of humans is going to max out at 9 billion. We're already in the 7 point something billion people, so we're getting very close to the part where we're going to hit this carrying capacity. And if you look at this graph, see how it goes up, it overshoots the carrying capacity, then these people run out of resources and they start to die. It goes under, and it'll likely sort of, do a little bit of a up, down, right around that carrying capacity. And we might be even seeing that now in the world where we actually lost quite a few people recently due to COVID-19. So that could be a sign of us sort of reaching that carrying capacity. Something that's going to help the human population to have less individuals that it'll need to sustain. Because the human population is growing really, really fast. So this is sort of a way of, I don't want to say killing them off, but, making it so our resources reach farther. So the pattern of population growth that results from carrying capacity is called a sigmoidal curve, or a S-shaped curve, known as the logistic growth pattern. What the heck does that all mean? Well, let me just erase this. Basically, if you look at this, it almost looks like an S. It starts out at the bottom. I can't write. I'm trying to write with an eraser. Starts out at the bottom, and then it goes like that. It's sort of in the shape of an S. So this is a type of growth model that happens, and it sort of levels out at the top when it hits that carrying capacity. What causes fluctuations in this type of growth of a population? Well, they're normally density dependent factors like competition. So if you're competing against other species, you could have predators, disease. Those are all things that are factors that could make this population fluctuate. And then things that do not have anything to do with how dense the population is, but natural disasters like floods, droughts, those are going to have major effects on a population. And then it's talking about lag phasing and log phase and stationary phase. All that really means is if you look back at up here, see how it's like, oh, we run out of food, now we're dying. Well, while these species are dying, now more food is being growing. So it's sort of like, this is the population, this red pinkish color curve, purple. Wow, don't know my colors. So if we were looking at that purplish curve, that would be the species. And if we were looking at the food, for instance, if food is what is making it so people can't survive, the food would sort of be in an opposite curve. So it would look something like this. Food is going up, population's going down. Population goes up, food goes down. Population goes down, food goes up. So it's sort of going the opposite. And that's what they call a lagging curve, but not too important for you guys in this class. I took like literally a couple classes in university on populations, and I find it interesting, but it's because I'm a sort of math nerd / biology nerd, so I get to mix those together when we're talking about populations. Anyway, we'll move on. So the pattern of a population growth that results from a lack of carrying capacity. So remember, carrying capacity, those are the ones that go like this, and then they sort of hit a roadblock, they run out of things. That's called your S curve. There's species that have something called a J curve. And those are species that don't really run out of resources. They don't really have much things that will stop them from growing. So once they got stuff, they just grow. And they keep growing exponentially. Okay? And an example of that is normally things like bacteria, viruses, those sort of things. They sort of don't run out of ways to grow. If we think about COVID-19, that would definitely be a J curve where it's exponentially growing. When we first saw in March, sort of the explosion of people having COVID-19, that was definitely because the virus was definitely growing at an exponential J curve. where it was exploding and it was being able to not really run out of ammo. It never had anything that was going to stop it from growing. Where if we look at more bigger species, they tend to follow this S curve because bigger things need more room and they need more food and all of that jazz, so they normally end up running out. So that's why we don't see millions of lions running around where we see lots of bunnies, for instance, or gophers. Because they're smaller, they need less food, there can be more of them. For us bigger things, we need more space, more food. There tends to be less of us. It all really is dependent on the resources that are available. And then as far as competition for resources, as I was just talking about lions, competition for resources like food, shelter, and mates is one of the main factors that limits population growth. Competition may exist within a species, so that means intraspecific competition, so you're fighting with your species, like a lion versus lion, or between species, and that's called interspecific competition. And that might be like a lion fighting a cheetah or something like that. So they still want the same thing, and they're fighting over that. So that's the different types of interactions or competition. There's a video here on human growth, and I'll maybe show you that later, or you can watch it actually yourself. I'm not going to run it through this. If we look at the human population, like I told you, the world population right now is at basically around 7 billion. And they believe that sort of like low, medium, and high explanations of what they think is going to happen. So they, like, a medium is around 9 billion, a lower one is around 8 billion is what they feel, and then a high one is around 15 billion, but they don't feel like we would be able to grow really any higher than that. And that's I don't even watch, what is that? It's called Avengers, so I don't really understand that joke. But I'm going to guess that Thanos, this guy, believed that the population would sort of run out at a certain time there, which it definitely hasn't. And the last part here of this is our life strategies. So there's basically 2 strategies the different species have. And one is R, one is K. I'm going to go over K first. K is us. These are longer lifespans, late reproductive age. So these are species that they're bigger. They have a really long lifespan. It takes many years possibly to be able to have babies themselves. They produce small numbers of offspring, so they don't necessarily have like a litter of something. They might have like one baby like us. We don't often have more than one baby. We don't have 10 babies at a time. We're very low numbers of offspring. We reproduce less often, so we don't reproduce all the time. We reproduce maybe once a year if we're talking about certain species of mammals. If you're talking about humans, even less. Well, depending on the person, I guess. We have long gestation periods, so that's how long you hold your baby. You have long periods of time, where you're having a baby. So elephants have the longest gestation period. I don't even remember what it is, but I think it's close to like 2 years of being pregnant, or 1.5 years, 2 years. I'm not really sure. Many months, way too long. But those long gestation periods make it, you're putting more energy into creating the species. It's bigger, it has more, I guess, you're putting all your energy into one, which is really, really important for that species. So you're putting all of your energy into that one species. And you have low biotic potential, so which I don't exactly know what that means, but I'll go back to this one. Maybe I'll think of what that means. And then the R selected strategies. So there's R strategists. These are short lifespan, early reproductive age. They have a small body. They produce large numbers of offspring. They reproduce quickly. They often are exponentially growing. And they have high biotic potential. I guess that biotic potential means just being able to grow or being able to live and pass on their genes. Way higher chance in these sort of strategies where they're creating lots and lots of offspring. Better chance of them, at least some surviving. So you may have heard of the phrase like no, I don't even know what the phrase is, but it's like not bigger is always better. Bigger is not always better, something along those lines. Saying that you as a species, if we were looking at this, you could have the strategy of, I'm just going to pump out as many babies as possible, and hope for the best, hope some survive. That was not the phrase that I was looking for. I was looking for quality over quantity. Yeah, our selected strategies have quantity. They create so many babies and hope some survive. K-selected strategists, they use quality. They put so much energy into one baby and they make sure that one has the best chance of surviving. So those are the two strategies. If we're looking at our strategists, like bugs do that, bacteria. If we're looking at K-strategists, bigger mammals like elephants, babies, us, that sort of stuff. Okay. So that's the end of that section. This is, I believe, 20.1 in your booklets. And then I'm going to, tomorrow I'll look at 20.2, and that will finish off chapter 20. And then we'll finish chapter 19 later in the week, or do that possibly at the first of next week. All right, and then that'll be all that we're going to go through in this class. So we can probably be done the information that we need to go through next week. So we'll still have a couple weeks left until all the work is done. All of your work is due on June 12th. And then you can pass in your work before June 12th. Because my report cards are due 2 days later, and then your marks will be final, and they will probably send you your report cards in the mail, I'm guessing. Unless we for some reason go back to school before then, but highly unlikely. Okay, so yeah.